Good day. Today is Friday, 23rd May 2025, and today we've had more news of further Russian advances in Ukraine. We've had admissions in interesting places like the Daily Telegraph about successful Russian battlefield tactics. We've had reports of divisions within the U.S. administration about how to approach the conflict in Ukraine. We've had further evidence of very visible divisions between the United States and Europe, which I will come to in a moment. And we've had further statements of resolve from the Russians about as they press forward with the negotiating process that is underway. Lastly, we've had some really strange comments and decisions from Chancellor Frédéric Matz of Germany. Let's start with the conflicts between the Europeans and the Americans, and they're not Ukraine related, but they do perhaps highlight the extent to which Donald Trump and his immediate circle are ultimately deeply antagonistic to the European Union and its project, and are making no attempt, frankly, to conceal this. So, Donald Trump, shortly before I started making this video, spoke about how he intended to introduce tariffs against the European Union at the level of 50% tariffs on imports into the United States of European goods. Now, if that is actually carried out, and at the moment I see no reason why it would not be, it would mean that imports from the European Union are charged a higher tariff at the American border currently than imports from China are. Imports from China are currently charged a tariff of 30%. Imports from the European Union would be charged a tariff of 50%. Now, this has already caused major economic disturbance in Europe and, by the way, in the United States too. There have been the predictable falls in the stock markets. There will no doubt be more reactions moving forward. But it is perhaps an interesting indicator that the economic climate between Europe and the United States is becoming colder, even as geopolitical perspectives between the Europeans and the Americans are, at least for the current time, diverging. Now, I say that the Europeans, ever since the Putin-Trump call of a few days ago, of Monday, the Europeans have been making quite clear their deep dissatisfaction and anger with Donald Trump, the extent to which they feel that they and Ukraine are being abandoned, as they put it, by the Americans. And, well, this announcement by the United States by Donald Trump, that the United States is preparing to impose 50% tariffs on European goods, is going to make the Europeans more angry and more pressured still, and perhaps even more mistrustful and critical of Donald Trump and of his presidency. Now, this may explain some rather strange decisions or comments that are coming from the German Chancellor Frédéric Matz. For example, the Financial Times is now reporting that Frédéric Matz is now actively lobbying the European Commission to impose sanctions, for the European Union to impose sanctions upon the Nordstream pipelines. Now, this is particularly strange because the Nord Stream pipelines, plural, not just Nord Stream 2, but Nord Stream 1 as well, and there are actually a number of pipes that make up the Nord Stream complex of pipelines, is partly German owned. The majority owner is or was Gazprom, operating through the umbrella of a Swiss-based company, but various German companies were also involved and had shares in the Nordstream pipelines. And the Nordstream pipelines were part of Germany's critical economic energy infrastructure. And now we have no less a person than the Chancellor of Germany asking the European Union to impose sanctions upon a part of Germany's own energy infrastructure, an enterprise partly owned by German companies and which is regulated to a great extent by German law. Now, this, in relation to a pipeline or group of pipelines, of which at least a part of them were destroyed in various mysterious explosions that took place in autumn 2022. The Germans and the Western powers generally initially pointed their finger at Russia. Various investigations were set up to find out what exactly happened, or so we were told, that they were set up for that purpose, what exactly happened and who was responsible. The investigations have come to all sorts of strange conclusions, that it was all carried out by 5 people on a yacht, on a boat, as I've described it. The U.S. investigative journalist Seymour Hersh has made allegations, which in my opinion have never been convincingly refuted, that in fact the party that really carried out the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines was the United States, the Biden administration. However, I would say that these, for the moment, do still remain allegations, because all of the investigations into this affair have gone nowhere very far. The information that they've obtained has not been shared with the Russians. The Russians have been prevented from participating in the investigations, and as I said, they've been denied sight of what the investigations have said. And anyway, it all remains mysterious. We have the story about the 5, or was it 6 people in a boat, 5 men and 1 woman, I seem to remember, on a boat, a small yacht. We've had claims to that effect. We've had claims that the former Ukrainian military chief, General Zaluzhny, who's currently in London as Ukraine's ambassador there, that he was the person who ultimately ordered this attack. President Zelensky supposedly was not involved or even informed. Anyway, this investigation, as I said, has now been wound up in several countries. The German investigation supposedly is still underway, but there's been no charges brought, as far as I'm aware, on any named individual. There's been allegations, claims, all of that, but no arrests, nothing. So that's the state of the pipelines. They're blown up, parts of them are blown up. The rest of them are lying idle. There's no gas passing through them. And Frédéric Matz now wants the EU to actually sanction them so as to close them permanently. Now, this, of course, begs the obvious question, because the reason the pipelines are lying idle is because Germany itself took a decision some years ago, back in 2022, that it was going to start cutting itself off from Russian gas. This continues to be denied in Germany itself. Olaf Scholz and recently Frédéric Matz have been saying for some time now, actually, that it was the Russians who took the decision to cut Germany and Europe off from Russian gas. The Russians applying the energy weapon, which, to say it simply, is an extraordinary retelling of what actually happened in the late winter and early spring of 2022, when the various EU sanctions against Russia were imposed. I am not going to go into the whole detail of that, but anyway, suffice to say that Scholz and Merz and others who say that in Germany, as far as I'm concerned, are stating nonsense. So, since it was the German government's decision to suspend operation on Nord Stream 2, which never actually entered into operation at all because the Germans slow walked and then failed to grant it a license to operate at all. And since the Nord Stream 1 pipelines are also essentially stopped, basically as a result of German government decision making. Why in that case does Frédéric Matz want to ask a third party, the European Union, to cut off the Nord Stream pipelines permanently by imposing European sanctions on them? Well, the Financial Times explains it all. It's done. We're told that Merz backs Nord Stream ban to prevent US and Russia restarting gas link. German Chancellor worried about reigniting domestic row over Russian gas imports. So it's been done for two reasons. Firstly, because Merz is very worried that the Russians and the Americans might decide to restart the Nord Stream pipelines. They might form some kind of consortium to enable gas to be supplied via the pipelines to Germany. And Merz is worried that some people in Germany might actually support that if it happens. So we read that Matthias Warnig, a former Stasi spy and close friend of Putin, all of that, by the way, is open to dispute. Warnig, for example, denies that he's a friend of Putin's, but never mind, has discussed a restart of the pipeline with the backing of US investors. People with knowledge of the talks said previously. Warnig has actually denied this, but never mind. There are reports circulating that the Russians and the Americans are indeed in discussions about restarting the Nord Stream pipelines. We're told that Warnig was seeking to leverage US President Donald Trump's desire for economic rapprochement with Moscow. Again, how exactly a German businessman leverages the President of the United States, nobody seems interested to explain, but that's what the Financial Times says. And we're then told that Trump's efforts, and notice that we've now moved from Warnig to Trump, Trump's efforts to negotiate a settlement with Russia over Ukraine have rekindled a debate in Germany over Nord Stream and Russian gas, which accounted for more than half of German gas imports before 2022. A survey by Forsa found that 49% of residents of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, the German state where Lubmin, the pipeline's terminus, is located, were in favor of resuming Russian gas supplies. The alternative for Germany, the AfD in other words, party, which has secured more than 20% of the vote nationwide in February elections, and which has increased its support since, but never mind, Financial Times doesn't say that, has called for bringing the pipelines back online as the Eurozone's largest economy grapples with high energy prices and stagnation. Well, the AfD proposing an obvious solution to that problem, but that is precisely what Frédéric Matz does not want. He does not want the pipelines brought back online because he prefers, presumably, high energy prices and stagnation to the threat to Germany or Europe of importing pipeline gas from Russia at lower competitive prices. It's more important to stop Russia's gas reaching Germany than it is apparently to end the stagnation caused in large part by high energy prices in Germany and Europe. And then we're told that the view of the AfD is shared by some business leaders and politicians from Merz's own centre-right Christian Democratic Union and his centre-left coalition partners, the Social Democrats. The Green opposition, Habeck and Baerbock and co., has blamed remnants of the Moscow connection within Germany's mainstream parties. In March, Michael Kretschmer, the CDU Prime Minister of the East German state of Saxony, said that maintaining punitive measures against Moscow was completely out of date and does not fit at all with what the Americans are doing right now. Responding to reports by the Financial Times and others about Nord Stream, CDU MP Thomas Barreis, in a LinkedIn post, saluted how business-minded our American friends are. Dietmar Woidke, the SPD Prime Minister of the East German state of Brandenburg, which, by the way, is the state that surrounds Berlin, called for a normalization of Germany's trade relations with Russia after the peace agreement. So all of this must be prevented at all costs. Sacrifice the German economy on the altar of sanctions. And because you're so worried that Germany itself might change its policy, might change its line, you've decided that since you can't trust future German governments to continue with the same policy of destroying German industry as the current German government, you want to get the European Union to sanction it for you. We're told, and this is again in the Financial Times, 3 officials familiar with the matter said that the Chancellor, in other words Scholz, sought to quell any domestic debates about the merits of a potential reactivation. And we are told that adding Nord Stream to the EU sanctions list potentially removes a political problem for Merz. So notice how political problems for Frédéric Matz are more important for Frédéric Matz than the economic health of Germany, or the condition of the German people, or the material conditions of the people of Europe. Just saying. That's a quote, by the way. And then we're also told that the punitive measures are also a way for Merz to Europeanize the fate of the pipeline instead of Berlin facing up potential US and Russian pressures on its own, another official said. So, as a result, Frédéric Matz goes and lobbies the European Commission, the European Union, to sanction Germany's own pipeline. I have to say, I am staggered. I find this absolutely incredible that the German Chancellor is prepared to go to these lengths to sabotage the future of the German economy by preventing future German governments from reactivating Nord Stream. As I said, it leaves me speechless. But this is what Germany has become. And incidentally, it also highlights what the European Union itself has become. Because, of course, what Merz is doing is he's creating a situation, or trying to create a situation, where if there is a German election, say in a year or 2 years' time, and say the AfD wins a plurality of votes in that election, and the result is a government is formed with or without the AfD, which is committed to reopening the Nord Stream pipelines and has say, a plurality of support within Germany to do that. It cannot do that because of the EU sanctions that Merz, the existing Chancellor, has arranged for the European Union to put in place. In other words, not only will this quell political challenges to Merz, it will foreclose options for Germany in the future, denying the German people their choice on what they can do in order to improve the long-term conditions of Germany. As I said, I am quite staggered by this. I mean, by now, I suppose, after all the years that we've been seeing more and more of this, I should cease to be surprised by things like this. But for all that, I still am. Now, a couple of weeks ago, about 2 weeks ago, when Putin was discussing the further sanctions that the EU might impose on Russia, sanctions intended to make the life of the Russians more difficult, but which, as Putin correctly pointed out, is much more likely to make the life of people in Europe more difficult. He said that even though this is completely irrational, the Russians have to assume that this sort of thing would be done because the European leaders behave in such an extraordinary, irrational way. They are, he said, idiots. Now that appeared initially on the Kremlin's own website. That word idiots appeared on the Kremlin's own website. It was then watered down, and I understand that the actual word in Russian is perhaps closer to half-wits than idiots. But reading all this in the Financial Times, how can you ultimately disagree with Putin, whatever the exact meaning of the word he used? I mean, anyway, I've said enough. I'm not going to add more to this. Merz has said more to other people as well. He apparently came along and has had a meeting or discussion with the Chinese president, Xi Jinping. I'm not sure whether he's in China, by the way, but apparently they've had a discussion. And again, according to the British media, he has told Xi Jinping to back Europe's peace plan to end the conflict in Ukraine. Now, the European peace plan presumably is the same plan that the Europeans presented to the Americans and the Ukrainians at the summit meetings in London and Paris that took place about 3 weeks ago now, 2-3 weeks ago now. And as I discussed them at the time, they are essentially demands for Russia's capitulation at the very time when the Russians are clearly winning the war, as none less a person than Donald Trump has said to the Europeans in the various calls that he has made over the course of the last week. Nonetheless, despite the fact that the Russians are winning the war, that the President of the United States says that he thinks the Russians are winning the war, or at least that President Putin thinks that the Russians are winning the war, Frédéric Matz expects the President of China, the man who went to Moscow just 2 weeks ago, who attended the Victory Day parade in Red Square, the man who is a friend of Vladimir Putin, the man who has signed further range of economic agreements with Russia, and who has spoken about Russia and China having a no-limits partnership. This person, apparently, Xi Jinping, is now being asked by the Chancellor of Germany, the man who has just taken a further step to sabotage permanently the economic recovery of Germany. This man, Merz, is now asking Xi Jinping to back the European peace plan, a plan which calls for Russia's surrender at precisely the moment when Russia, Xi Jinping's and China's ally, is in the process of winning its war. Again, it is... Again, I can't come up with a different word than stupid, idiotic, if you like, going from what Putin said. But that is what Matz now apparently has apparently said to Xi Jinping. What Xi Jinping said in response, I would love to have heard. Knowing how Xi Jinping handles these discussions, I suspect that, as he always does with foreign leaders, except on the very, very rare occasions when Xi Jinping does lose his temper, which he can do. I saw him once doing it in public with Justin Trudeau. But anyway, I suspect that what Xi Jinping did was that he listened politely and he said to Merz, oh yes, well, we'll think about this. In other words, he humoured the idiot. Because that's the only way to deal with a demand of this kind, a request of this kind. Of course, Merz could have taken a completely different approach. He could have told Xi Jinping that Europe has a crisis in Ukraine and a crisis with Russia, that Europe is very anxious to find a way out, that Europe is looking to resolve the conflict in Ukraine in ways that will preserve Ukraine. He could have acknowledged that China has been attempting to perform some kind of a mediation exercise for the last 2 years, that there is a Chinese peace envoy, Li Hui, who the Europeans have essentially ignored and who the Ukrainians have treated in the most boorish fashion. He could have asked Xi Jinping for help with all of that. And he could have asked Xi Jinping to see if China could perhaps facilitate a meeting or discussion between the Europeans and specifically the Germans and the Russians with a view to resolving the crisis in Europe. But no, Frédéric Matz comes along, he comes and talks to Xi Jinping, one of the most powerful men in the world, and he asks China, Xi Jinping, to do this ridiculous thing. Again, I'm speechless. I should be unsurprised by this, but I still am. I still struggle to come to terms with a reality in which the leaders of once mighty nations like Germany, France and Britain behave in this bizarre way. Anyway, that's Matz. Going back to what I was saying before, the Germans, desperate to prevent the Americans and the Russians making peace with each other, settling perhaps the conflict in Ukraine, agreeing to resume commercial links with each other, agreeing to supply Germany with cheap gas together, this apparently is his greatest ever nightmare. And now, having done absolutely nothing since he was Chancellor, or since he was elected Chancellor, or before he was elected Chancellor, to develop a good relationship with Donald Trump, to try and work out some kind of arrangements with Donald Trump for the future of Germany, which is, or was, first and foremost an export economy, one which exports to the United States, as well as, by the way, to China. Instead of doing any of that, what does Frédéric Matz do? He behaves in this bizarre fashion, tries to get the Chinese to back a European peace plan, which cuts across the American peace plan. Not that either of these peace plans is workable, but the European one is particularly idiotic. And he wants to sabotage possible American attempts, perhaps involving Donald Trump, to restart the Nordstream pipelines so as to get Germany cheaper Russian gas. Now, on top of all of that, he's facing 50% tariffs on exports by Germany to the United States. Already, more and more German companies have been closing down production in Germany, and some of them have been relocating to China, by the way, and some of them have been relocating to the United States or saying they will. Who now expects that to change? The German business community is being told that they will never get cheap gas from Russia again. In other words, they will never get energy at competitive prices because the Chancellor of Germany is working with the European Union to make that impossible. And at the same time, they are faced with the fact that the President of the United States is imposing 50% tariffs on their exports to the United States. Any German business group, big industrial company with business with the United States, is now going to say to itself, the only way out of this is to relocate to the United States, at least in some form, to take advantage of the lower energy costs there and to escape the tariffs. You would have thought that this would be Frédéric Matz's main priority and principal concern. No, striking poses with Xi Jinping and sabotaging any attempts to get Nord Stream working again. Those are the priorities instead of the Chancellor of Germany. I weep for a country, Germany, for which I have deep affection, and I am very, very sorry for the German people that they are led by someone like this. That's all I can say. Well, anyway, that's the Europeans and the Americans. I suspect that the gulf between them is going to grow. I think that the Americans and the Chinese can negotiate toughly with each other and will probably come in time to understandings with each other. I think, this is my own guess, that this is the beginning of an economic divorce by the United States and Europe as well. I think that it is unlikely to be reversed. I think it's quite plausible the tensions between Europe and the United States are now going to start to grow. And by the way, I think I'm right in saying that I've just read that the United States has begun to withdraw 4,000 troops from somewhere in Europe. Anyway, it looks as if the United States is beginning to pull back from its military stance in Europe, and it is certainly doing so. I have certainly read somewhere that it is now withdrawing troops, by the way, from South Korea as well. So anyway, there it is. An extraordinary sequence of decisions. Baffling to me if one is looking at this from a European perspective, but completely unsurprising. Meanwhile, the Europeans are busy, and Ursula von der Leyen now has apparently jumped on the Lindsey Graham pipeline. The bandwagon, I should say, not pipeline. She too is now proposing that the European Union impose tariffs, sanctions on countries which in future import Russian energy products, oil and gas and that kind of thing. Whether she'll be able to get the European Union as a whole to agree to that, I don't know, but she's suggesting this. Of course, it is what Lindsey Graham is also proposing in the United States. And there was an article in the American media which said that Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, is playing an extremely complicated game, which is that on the one hand, publicly, as I discussed in a program a few days ago, he appears to be opposing this push towards further sanctions, which, to be clear, are not actually sanctions against Russia. They are against countries that import energy from Russia. Just saying. So apparently Marco Rubio is opposed to this, at least in public, but in private, he's doing everything he can, supposedly, to encourage Lindsey Graham. And there's been people who have commented upon the fact that Rubio is talking about these sanctions all the time. He's doing so incessantly. It could be that he's doing that to put pressure on the Russians. Maybe he is. But it could also be seen by people like Lindsey Graham as basically an encouragement to press forward with this idea of sanctions, these specific sanctions. Now, I've discussed this already and exhaustively. The major importer at the moment, the biggest importers of Russian oil at the moment, are China and India. Both countries see imports of Russian oil as essential for themselves. The Chinese, who've just been through a brief economic war with the United States, will not want to stop importing oil from Russia because from their point of view, this is a matter of strategic importance. India will also want to continue its imports of Russian oil for rather different reasons. As I said, I've discussed all of that in previous programs. Now, Lindsey Graham and Ursula von der Leyen are proposing to sanction them. To sanction China and India. China, the world's biggest manufacturing and trading economy, impose, in effect, an economic blockade on China all over again, using the pretext that China imports Russian oil. By the way, the Chinese will almost certainly say to themselves that this is, in reality, a device to reimpose massive tariffs on them, dressing this up as an attempt to stop imports of Russian oil. Even if the Chinese were to say that they were no longer importing Russian oil, as night follows day, there would be claims and reports in the United States that they were breaching the American sanctions and were imposing and were importing Russian oil, so that the 500% tariffs would come. And we were going to be thrown back into that economic war that we briefly lived through in April, for the period from March, April, until the beginning of this month. An economic war between the USA and China that has already had a visible impact on world trade and which has badly affected the development of the US economy. Again, has this been discussed with the US Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, who appears anxious to reduce tariffs? Has the German business community been consulted about this? The United States is one of Germany's biggest markets. China is another one of Germany's biggest markets. If Ursula von der Leyen has her way and the European Union starts imposing these tariffs or sanctions, the Chinese are bound to reciprocate. To whom are the Germans going to export? They can't export to the Americans because of the American tariffs. They can't export to the Chinese because of Ursula's sanctions. Whom are they going to be exporting to? Who exactly are they going to be exporting to? Well, there's the captive markets within the European Union, but they're all in crisis. There the rest of the world too, but then the rest of the world is also going to be affected one way or the other by this economic rupture. First of all, German exporters will come up against the far mightier and better organized Chinese exporters who will be flooding the goods with markets that they can no longer sell to the European Union and to the United States, and who, unlike the Germans, will have cheap Russian oil and gas at probably lower than market prices behind them. Again, do these people know what they are doing? Have they thought this out at all? Do they ever think things out? Do they ever get advice? Who do they get their advice from? Now, I say that I was reading an article, the latest in the series of articles by Seymour Hersh. Interesting article in some ways, because Seymour Hersh sought advice from three people, according to him, about how long Russia could continue to endure, could afford to sustain the war in Ukraine. And he consulted three people: a businessman who knows Russia, has done business there, and who's familiar with the Russian economy, an economist who clearly doesn't know Russian at all, and somebody who also advises the Fed in the United States. The economist who doesn't know Russia and the person who advises the Fed who doesn't know Russia, they both think that the Russians might find it difficult to sustain indefinitely the economic costs of the war. The businessman who does actually know Russia thinks otherwise. He thinks that because of the economy's extremely low gearing, its very low debt levels, Russia is in a position to keep going and can keep going pretty much indefinitely. He has more concerns about the financial stability of the United States. Who do you believe? The actual person who knows the country, the businessman, or the other two? One, presumably, a person who works on abstract numbers and complex mathematically based theorems, and the other, an advisor who no doubt does the same thing. Well, I know who I go with. I go with a businessman. I go with the person who actually knows how business works. But, to say it again, I doubt that governments, people like Lindsey Graham in the United States, or Ursula, if it comes to that, are getting advice, are seeking out the advice of people like that. Once upon a time, it was different. Now, again, probably the best person to discuss all of this with, maybe I will discuss it one day with him, is Ray McGovern, who was, of course, a top CIA analyst in the 60s and 70s. And I can say quite definitely that at that time, I have no doubt at all that the US intelligence community, when trying to understand what was going on in the Soviet economy, would have had discussions with business people, Western business people, who were actually operating inside the Soviet Union, running businesses there, maintaining contacts with Soviet officials and doing that kind of thing. Today, I get the sense that governments are just not interested in this sort of thing anymore. They go to whoever tells them what they want to hear. They don't actually go out of their way to get advice from the people who actually know. So there it is. That's the strange world into which we're heading. The Americans and the Russians, as the Americans and the Europeans, likely to argue with each other. The Americans arguing with themselves. Economic sense and reason in the European Union thrown out of the window. And in the United States, perhaps the Secretary of State playing a very complex game of intrigue against his own boss, Donald Trump, who, according to these same media reports, perhaps because his instinct tells him otherwise, opposes sanctions. On the topic of Donald Trump, there was a very interesting interview with the U.S. Vice President, J.D. Vance, which said that Donald Trump is an unusual individual in that he tends to get people right, that he works very well, he's at his best when he has contacts with people, and that if he works with them for any time, when he meets and has dealings with them, he very quickly decides who is sound and who is not. And that does seem to reinforce the sense I have of Donald Trump, that this is a president who is at his best when he follows his instincts. On that topic, by the way, and very briefly, his instincts are not infallible. When he first became president, in the first weeks of his presidency, he placed great trust in the FBI's then director, James Comey, and paid a terrible price for this. I say that because Comey has, I noticed, just resurfaced, and I'm not going to discuss what he's been up to. But there you have an example, at least, of where Donald Trump made a critical mistake. But anyway, it is the case, or it does seem to me to be the case, that Trump does sometimes instinctively understand things which others apparently are deaf and blind to. They don't seek out the right evidence. They don't think it through. They have the sense that, well, if they do it, it must be right. And since it is right, it must work regardless of the underlying realities. Well, that's the Americans and that's the Europeans. That's Frédéric Matz especially. Let's talk now about what the Russians are up to, because the Russians have also been saying some very interesting things. Now, one person who's been speaking is the Russian President, Vladimir Putin. Now, he had a meeting with members of the government. This is the civilian government, the people who are headed by the Russian Prime Minister, Mr. Mishustin. And some of this discussion centered on the economic rehabilitation of the frontline regions, Bryansk, Belgorod and Kursk, which have been the target of Ukrainian attacks. And Putin mentioned in passing that the Russian military has been ordered to create a buffer zone in Ukrainian territory to protect these regions from further attacks by Ukraine. And this has attracted a great deal of attention, even though it's actually something that Putin has basically said previously. So anyway, that's Putin. I don't think too much needs to be read into these words. But anyway, we now have it officially that the Russians are indeed going to cross into Sumy region as well. And they're going to seek to take some territory in Sumy region under control. And they're also, by the way, expanding their area of control. In Kharkiv region, they seem to be busy at the moment clearing Volchansk, the areas around Volchansk, of Ukrainian forces. And who knows, it may be that the buffer zone, when it's finally established, will become something else. Not just a buffer zone, but an assembly point for Russian armies that might be sent further westwards towards the cities of Sumy, the much bigger city of Kharkiv, and perhaps ultimately Kiev itself. Who's to say? But other Russians have been saying other things. First of all, Putin's spokesman, Peskov, has also been talking, and he says that yes, the Russians are indeed working hard on sorting out the memorandum that they proposed to present to the Ukrainians for the next set of talks. These talks are to happen fairly soon, or so Peskov says. But he also said that there's so far been no agreement either on the venue of the talks or on the timing of the talks. Everybody agrees that there should be talks, but there's been no agreement so far as to when they will take place or where they will take place. Now, Lavrov has also been speaking, and he's been saying actually a great deal. First of all, he's made it fairly clear that the Russians are not entirely keen on the Vatican as a mediating party or as a venue for further negotiations. He said, and this is, I take this from TASS, speaking about the Vatican's proposal to serve as a platform for the next round of negotiations, Lavrov spoke against wasting efforts in order to work out options that are not quite realistic. Imagine the Vatican as a venue for negotiations. I would say it's a bit inelegant when Orthodox countries will be discussing issues related to the elimination of the root causes of the Ukrainian conflict on Catholic soil. And Lavrov specifically drew attention to the fact that one of the conflict's root causes is the drive of what he refers to as the Kiev regime to eradicate the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So the Russians are not really keen on this idea. Whether they will simply reject it is another thing. Anyway, another Russian official, by the way, has spoken about this. He said, and this is Rodion Miroshnik, and he spoke on Solovyov Live TV, and he said that he does not accept the manner in which the venue of the negotiations is being imposed and a particular site demanded without the consent of the second party, simply because it seems suitable to the first party. Such proposals are unacceptable for negotiations set up to achieve a result, because the main task is not to solve the problem of where the negotiations will be held. And Miroshnik then went on to say, before the direct meeting, there is a long preparation period, negotiations on negotiations, during which parties agree on the meeting venue, the delegation composition, and the issues to be discussed. All this is done behind closed doors until a compromise is reached. Therefore, let's just say that there is no reason to say that everything has been agreed upon. The venue of the talks is determined once both sides have agreed to it. Once this has happened, we can say that the two groups are ready to go, and the host party agrees to organise the site for negotiations according to the regulations regarding security and logistics. So the Russians do not like the idea of the Vatican. There is a Catholic community in the Vatican. There is the church in Ukraine, which follows Orthodox rites but considers itself part of the Catholic community. The Russians probably at some level feel that the Vatican is likely to be structurally sympathetic to Ukraine. They don't like the idea of the Vatican at all. And I wonder whether the talks, in light of all of this, will indeed be held there. But anyway, going back to Lavrov, he had a lot more to say. First of all, he made it very clear that the Russians are absolutely determined to ensure the protection of Russian speakers in whatever remains of Ukraine. If the so-called government, which is basically Zelensky's junta, believes that somehow an agreement will be reached on the cessation of hostilities and what remains of Ukraine will continue to live according to the laws that they have enacted, this is an illusion. It cannot be allowed under any circumstances. And it would be a crime to leave people in Ukraine under the authority of a Zelensky regime that bans the Russian language. Millions of people on the territory of Ukraine speak Russian. It is their mother tongue, and leaving them under the rule of this junta, which has forbidden them to speak Russian, but thankfully not from thinking in it, would be a major crime. I do hope that, and I am sure that we, that is to say Russia, will not let this happen. I hope that the international community stands up against the abuse of the UN Charter, which states in its opening provision that it encourages respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, regardless of race, sex, language, or religion. So the Russians are not going to shift on this, and that's, again, what Lavrov is saying. And that might be another reason, by the way, why the Russians are not keen on the Vatican. They might feel that the Vatican is not fully sympathetic to this. Though I'm not sure, by the way, that they're right on any of these points, by the way. My own sense, on the contrary, this is just my own personal view, is that the Vatican, if it were to be invited to act as the mediator and were to provide a venue, would actually strive to be impartial. That's my opinion. I don't know very much about the people there. I might be wrong, but anyway, the Russians are not keen on this idea, and they're making it fairly clear why that is the case. Anyway, the Russians have been saying some other things. They've been talking about the fact that they have no illusions about the improvement of relations with the United States. And this is Lavrov again. We are naturally sober-minded people in the political sense. It is crucial not to succumb to illusions, to remain realistic and aware that there have been numerous instances where the United States has drastically reversed its stance. Such is life. There is no escaping this reality. This factor must be taken into account. We certainly consider it carefully in planning our actions. When Russian presidential aide Yuri Ushakov and I met with Marco Rubio and Michael Waltz in Riyadh at the American suggestion, both sides clearly agreed that the foreign policy of normal countries should be rooted in national interests. This reflects the positions of Trump and Putin. This is not about ideological considerations or attempts to expand influence indiscriminately. This was the central theme of our discussions in Riyadh. In observing current developments, I believe the Trump administration is acting in accordance with this approach. This is how we've always behaved. We've never lectured anyone. It represents a significant shift in Washington's policy compared to the previous Democratic administrations. We observe this policy has caused considerable turmoil among the U.S. elite, including within the Republican ranks. Many are unaccustomed to operating in this manner. They're not used to a situation where they can't control or decide everything. So Lavrov is saying the United States, at the moment, says it wants some kind of rapprochement with us, but we are not counting on it. We will do what we can in our own interests, but we are fully alive to the possibility that in a few years' time, a new administration might come in which reverses everything and goes back to the policy of extreme hostility to Russia, which the Joe Biden administration followed. By the way, on that, the Russians almost certainly have read an article, actually I believe it was an editorial in the New York Times, which said that very thing. It was quite extraordinary, in fact, how straightforwardly it was written. It said that Putin, the Russians, know perfectly well that there is a strong structural hostility to Russia within the United States amongst a section of the American people and within the US elite, that it is therefore very likely that the policy of the United States will change and in future will become hostile to Russia again, and that Putin and the Russians know it. So Russian policy at the present time is to take advantage of whatever opportunity is provided by the existence of an administration which unusually does appear to want to improve relations with Russia, because the Russians know that they cannot be sure that once this administration has left the scene, the next administration will indeed follow that same line. It's the most extraordinary article in the New York Times. A threat, perhaps, to US officials and to US businesses that might be thinking about doing business in Russia in the future. A warning to the Russians from the New York Times. Don't think that we've really changed. We still oppose you completely. We know what you're up to. You're trying to take advantage of Trump in order to improve your positions, but don't expect him to be there very long. When the time comes, we will reverse and go back and resume our policy of hostility to you. It will go on indefinitely and forever, and in effect, there is absolutely nothing you can do to change it. Well, as we see from Lavrov, the Russians, as he says, are also under no illusions about this. So, coming back to the negotiations, we do have negotiations which are supposed to be underway between the Ukrainians and the Russians. We will see when and if the next meeting does take place. We will see where it takes place, whether it takes place in Istanbul again, or in the Vatican, or somewhere else. My sense from reading Lavrov and Miroshkin's comments is that they would rather that the meeting took place outside Europe, not just not in the Vatican, but outside Europe altogether. They would prefer that it took place in, say, Riyadh or Istanbul again, but they're not keen that the venue should be the Vatican. Putting aside whatever religious or other biases the Vatican might have, and personally, as I said, I don't think it has very strong biases at all. On the contrary, up to now, Vatican policy on this conflict has been even-handed and, in my opinion, constructive. But putting all that aside, I think the Russians don't want to hold the negotiations in Europe, in a city, Rome, which is a capital of an EU country, where their delegation might be under pressure and where the Ukrainians might be able to receive constant, continuous support from their various European allies. Anyway, we will see whether it happens, whether there is an agreement about a venue, whether the meeting does take place, and above all, we will see what happens in the United States, whether when the Russians present the memorandum with all of the demands that we already know, Istanbul Plus and all that, whether at that point the Ukrainians will simply say there's no further point in negotiating at all, and whether at that point Ursula and Lindsey Graham are able to move forward, perhaps with Rubio's backing, or perhaps not, whether they'll be able to move forward with their sanctions bills and get them through Congress. If my own view remains, by the way, that if Trump is opposed, this is unlikely to pass. I suspect that many senators, Republican senators, will not want to take on Trump. And I suspect that Speaker Johnson in the House of Representatives, if Trump remains opposed, will simply block the will block the bill and won't present it to the House. Those are my guesses, but we will see. It could become another drama like the one that played out in the winter of 2023-2024 when Speaker Johnson was again blocking the further supply of funding and weapons to Ukraine. We'll see how it plays out. Meanwhile, we're getting more news about the progress of the war. There's been a very interesting article in the Daily Telegraph which talks about Russian tactics, and the fact admits somewhat grudgingly that they've been successful. It says that when the Russians attack positions that the Ukrainians have assumed, they first attack with infantry. The infantry then causes the Ukrainians to establish positions which then expose the Ukrainians to attack by Russian drones. Then if the Ukrainians try to fortify their positions by building heavy trenches and other things, then the Russians bomb the fortifications and destroy them with fab bombs, of which they are supposed to be producing around 75,000 a year over and on top of the Soviet stockpile that already exists. The article interested me not because I think this is necessarily a true description of Russian tactics, even though the Daily Telegraph says that they are indeed proving successful on the battlefronts, but because of the interesting comments it made about the effectiveness of the Russian guided fab bombs, the way that they're able to demolish Ukrainian defenses and all of that. Now, some of you who follow my programs may remember that about 6 weeks ago, or maybe a bit longer ago, there was an article by David Axe, which appeared, I think, in Forbes, which was also, by the way, referenced in the Daily Telegraph, which is about how the fab bombs had lost their effectiveness because of successful Ukrainian jamming. And the article relied heavily on some social media comments by a Russian blogger called Firebomber, who is probably, it must be said, connected in some way with the Russian Air Force, who was complaining about Ukrainian success in jamming Russian fab bombs. I'd devoted a significant part of one of my videos to those two articles. I made the point that despite Firebomber's concerns, it was almost certain that the Russians would find a solution to this problem, as they always do. And it turns out that if the problem ever existed, it clearly has been solved, because the Daily Telegraph tells us that the Russians are able to bomb successfully Ukrainian fortifications on the front lines. So it doesn't seem that Ukrainian jamming is that effective after all, at least where the front lines are concerned. Anyway, there have been other articles, and there's been a lot of articles now from the Ukrainians complaining about the increasing effectiveness of Russian drones. Now, the former Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief, General Zaluzhny, has just given a lecture in which he has talked about the Ukraine having no ability to recapture militarily the territory it has lost, but being able to hold the Russians back by applying modern technology. And of course he was talking about drones. and he seems to believe that the Ukrainians are still successful using drones in withstanding Russian advances. To my mind, the entire lecture exposed the fact that as a result of his posting to London, and I'm going to guess the cutting off of information to him from the Ukrainian military by the Zelensky government, Zelensky is losing touch with the realities of the situation. Because I've been reading a whole set and cluster of comments from various Ukrainian commentators who all complain about the number and effectiveness and increasing success of Russian drones. I read, for example, about how the Russians are soon likely to be able to put up to 500 Geran drones over Ukrainian skies every night. 500 Geran drones. I've read about how these drones, the Geran drones, have increased immensely in effectiveness, how the warheads have become more powerful, how the engines have become more powerful, how they can fly higher and faster or lower, how they can dive onto targets, how they're becoming increasingly adept at evading defenses. I've also been reading about various other types of drones that the Russians have been deploying on the battlefronts. I remember about a year and a half ago saying that sooner or later one of the sides, probably the Russians, would begin to develop countermeasures to drones, and I speculated that one of them might be hunter-killer drones, drones used to destroy FPV drones, the kamikaze drones that both sides have been using on the battlefronts. And now Russian hunter-killer drones have indeed appeared, tracking down and destroying Ukrainian drones before these can do any harm. And they're apparently becoming increasingly active on the battlefronts as well. I've also been reading about a Russian drone group, an elite drone group called Rubicon, that is being deployed in critical areas of the battlefronts, and of the extraordinary success it is having in destroying Ukrainian vehicles and personnel and the rest. And lastly, I've been reading about how some Russian drones are now able to operate 100 kilometers behind the front lines, that they do so autonomously using presumably some kind of AI technology. They're not connected to their controllers, and they select in some form their own targets and carry out their own attacks. And I've also been reading how right across the battlefronts the Russians outgun and out-armor the Ukrainians, and in places have numerical superiority over them, and how they continue their advances right across the battlefronts too. Now, I've been meaning to do a summary of the state of the war, and no doubt I will find the time at some point to do so. I'm afraid, again, I'm not really in a position to do so for this program. All I will say is that it seems to me that a critical situation is developing for the Ukrainians in three places. One is in the Liman-Siversk area. I think we can start to talk about this area as being connected. The second, which is perhaps more important for the Ukrainians, is at the southern end of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk-Konstantinovka conurbation. I appreciate that because I'm not going into details in my various programs, I'm not describing the developments here. But every day, more positions, Ukrainian positions, south of Konstantinovka fall There are reports of Ukrainian troops trapped in semi-cauldrons in several places south of Konstantinovka and trying to retreat and facing heavy losses whenever they try to do so, and of the Russians steadily moving closer to Konstantinovka and being actually essentially in the southern outskirts. And there's also been further news in the Pakrovsk area, and it seems to me that having stabilized their position southwest of Pakrovsk, in places like Kotlino and Udachne, putting themselves in a position to cut supplies to Pakrovsk along the roads leading to Pakrovsk and the rest, the Russians at the moment are mostly focused on cutting off Ukrainian supplies from the north and from by basically putting themselves in a position where they can block resupply to Pakrovsk from the north, and they're doing so by pushing forward and capturing more and more positions east and north of Pakrovsk. And increasingly now, it looks as if Russian forces are converging on the important village of Novoekonomichny. I've referred to it many times in many programs. The Russians haven't yet reached this village, but they're getting closer every day. The assault on this village is sure to come. If this village is captured, then I'm going to suggest that Mirnograd is lost. And once Mirnograd is lost, so will Pakrovsk be. Anyway, so events are moving with growing speed on the battlefronts in this area too. And further south, towards the Dnieper, the Russians, or so it seems to me, are now also in a position to engage in further advances. They have apparently succeeded in breaking through into Dnieper region itself. There's reports that they've just captured a village called Otradnoye. There are reports on Russian channels that by advancing to these positions, the Russians have put the urban and industrial sprawl of Donbass finally behind them, that once Pakrovsk is captured, there are no real obstacles left for the Russians to move westwards, firstly to the city of Pavlograd, and beyond that to Dnipro and the river, the Dnieper. Well, there we go. I mean, as I said, I will try to find the time for a more thorough discussion of the state of the battlefield. But suffice to say that for the moment, not only do the Russians continue to have the advantage right across the battlefronts, but every day the progress continues and is accelerating, and all of this before the main blow falls. Now, I'm going to finish this program by touching on the situation in the Middle East. Now, as you all know, I have been away in St. Petersburg for a couple of days, and the week before I was very, very tied up with all sorts of matters, some of them related to preparations for that trip. Also, I was obviously heavily focused on the constant movement involving the negotiations in the conflict in Ukraine. As a result, I lost touch, if you will, fully with the situation in the Middle East. Now, I'm going to say quickly a few things about this. Firstly, a narrative has been spreading amongst a number of people that there has been some faltering of Western support for Israel. Well, over the last 2 or 3 days, I have finally become, rather belatedly I admit, to understand exactly what is happening in Gaza. Now, at this point, I'm afraid I have to be extremely careful what I say. The sensitivities of platforms are becoming demanding, to say the least, and the British authorities have recently taken to questioning people who return from foreign visits if they say things which the British authorities are unhappy about. And of course, I am somebody who travels. There are more things that can follow beyond that as well. So I have to think about all of these matters. But it seems to me that we're well beyond the point of a mere breakdown of a ceasefire in Gaza. Things are being done now which, well, have a scale and a nature which I would once never have imagined conceivable. And in light of these enormous events that are taking place, I'm going to say that I think the criticisms of Israel, the muted criticisms of Israel that are being made by European governments, are not genuine criticisms at all. They are simply attempts to give those governments an alibi in light of the horror that is taking place there. As for reports that Israel is planning to strike at Iran without first getting the consent of the United States, I don't really believe that. I think that this is, again, a further attempt by some people in Israel to put political pressure on Donald Trump and the United States to fall into line with Israeli plans. So I'm afraid I have become even more skeptical about the stories about the rift between the West and Israel than I had been previously. For the record, I think that when these events are written up, it will be seen very clearly that we have, all of us in the West, descended into a moral abyss. The political consequences are going to be dreadful. The moral consequences are far, far worse. And shame on our leaders who don't see that. Well, this is where I finish my program today. I would love to say a lot more about these last points. Perhaps one day the day will come when I can. But anyway, that is what I think and how I feel, and this is where I end today's program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.